Welcome back to New Testament Survey. My name is Pastor Jason Huffman and excited to be with you here again in our second session of this course. If you remember last week, we talked about sort of the background of the New Testament, and really we focused a lot on that one blank page in between the Old and New Testament there. We called that the intertestamental period between the Testaments, and how so much was going on in world history. We had the empires of Babylon, Persia, Greek, and Rome. All coming and rising and falling, with the introduction of Rome as a world empire prior to the coming of Jesus Christ, and how really, as we saw in Galatians 4, chapter 4, verse 4, that God had predetermined, He had set a moment in time in which to send His Son, and how God's sovereign will, His will that is above and beyond all things, will not be thwarted, as Isaiah said. It will prevail. That God's desire for certain things to happen are sure and true, and His sovereignty and His power make sure that they reach their fulfillment. And how on a national scale we saw that impacting the world, but even connecting it to a personal level, how it filtered down through the cross and Jesus' work and who He is as a person, as our Savior, that God is very interested even in His personal will for our lives, and that even though we play a part in the fulfilling and the unfolding of God's personal will in our lives, that God's desire is that even you and I walk out His personal will in a very intimate way, and He is going to come along and support us in that. And so later on in the course, we'll look at the differences between God's sovereign will and God's personal will for us. There is a significant difference, especially the one where Jesus Christ coming back. There's nothing nobody can do about that. He is coming back, and we can have faith and hope and assurance in that. But today what I want to do for this session is just dig a little bit deeper into the different categories, and the first one in particular that we talked about last time. And so remember, we talked about the five categories of New Testament writing. Those were obviously number one, the Gospels, and then the book of history, which is Acts. So history is number two, and then number 3 and 4 are both letters. We divided those up between the Pauline letters, or Paul's letters, and then the general letters, general epistles, and then finally the book of prophecy or apocalyptic book, which is the book of Revelation. And so today, what I want to do is I want to examine the Gospels. We're going to start there, okay? Might as well begin at the beginning, begin at the life of Jesus. And I have a little story. It kind of helps to, at least it helped me to frame the question, why are there 4 Gospels? Why not just one great story of Jesus, and that's what everybody kind of reads and connects with? Well, somebody had told me this before, and it kind of helped me to understand. Imagine this. Here's the example. Imagine this. We have a car accident, a random car accident. Nothing brutal. Nobody really gets hurt. Just a minor fender bender, right? But the witnesses to that accident, there happened to be 4 of them. And let's say that one was a doctor. He happened to be going to work at the time and saw the accident take place. And another person that witnessed the accident was a mechanic. And maybe the third person was a mother walking her child, and the fourth a businessman. But here's the idea, is that when the police arrived to take a report on the accident, and they began to ask all the different witnesses, all 4 of them, about what happened and what took place, what were the events of the accident, you can imagine that the way in which the mechanic communicates the accident would be probably more in line of, well, obviously there was a mechanical failure. I saw the equipment on the vehicle fail in this way, and the impact caused this to the 2 vehicles. This is probably what it's going to cost. That would be the direction probably that a mechanic would head as far as communicating his perspective of the accident. Now, a doctor, on the other hand, would be communicating and discussing about the same event. The event doesn't change. It's a constant. It's truth, and it exists for what it is, but the doctor would have maybe a very different take on that event. He would probably discuss far less about the equipment, the vehicles or things like that, but he would spend more time talking about the people involved and whether or not they were wearing their seatbelt, and whether or not there were physical injuries, and hey, whiplash would have been you kind of following me there? And probably the mother and the businessman would have very different perspectives of the accident. Once again, the accident being a constant. Well, in all of human history, in all of eternity, Jesus Christ is a constant. And what we have here in the Gospels are 4 authors giving their perspective, their view, or like a Rubik's Cube, kind of their side of this Jesus event, of this story. Now, this is a very wonderful way to view Jesus because it enables us to see Jesus and what he did and the lives that he impacted through different people's perspectives, through the eyes of other people who may not be kind of in our sort of in our realm, our sphere of filters, if that makes sense. For instance, Matthew was a tax collector. When he talks about Jesus, he's framing this experience, this constant event, this Jesus event and what Jesus did and was, around and through the filter of him actually being a tax collector. John, the beloved disciple, the one who leaned so close to Jesus that Jesus could hear him whispering in the upper room. Just this intimate relationship, you know. And Mark, not even one of the disciples, a young kid at the time, you can imagine his perspective was unique. And Luke, a Gentile who didn't even travel with Jesus, he wasn't even there, but probably receiving much of his information, and as we know, and we'll look at his book through extensive study. He was a historian and a physician himself. So the four Gospels are really unique and really beautiful in that they give us four really wonderful pictures of who Jesus was, what he did. Now I want to give you kind of like a framework for that. That'll help you really kind of categorize those things. And then as it really helped me is when I went back, you know, through my time and reading the Bible and doing my devotional with God and all those different things, as I began to read the Gospels after understanding these kind of things, a lot more just really started to jump out of the page at me, you know? And I began to see some of the beauty in the authorship and the personality of those authors really come through in their stories about Jesus Christ. And so let me draw for you. I'm going to pull in the board here, and then we're going to do a kind of like a chart, if you will. And so if you have a piece of paper, you're taking notes here, what you'll want to do is maybe draw a table or something like that. And so I'm going to try and draw it here on the board. If you've been with me in other classes, you know that artistry is not my forte. So I'm going to apologize at the beginning, but I'm going to do the best I can here. So help me out and give me grace. All right. So let's list the four Gospels, okay? I'm going to abbreviate them for you just for sake of timing. Matthew, Mark, Luke. I told you I wasn't good at this. Okay. I just want to move it over a little bit more so I have a little more space. So Matthew, Mark, Luke starts with a K, and John. Okay, there we go. So those are our four Gospels. We're going to kind of do a contrast comparison together with them, you know, and the material and different things like that. Now, first thing I want to make note of is the number of chapters. Okay, Matthew has 28 chapters. Mark has 16 chapters, and you'll see why this is significant once we get into kind of talking about the little materials there. And it's not going to be a very, very big chart. I don't know how big you're drawing it in your notes, but I would figure we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 9 or 10 different things that we're going to list out here. Luke has 24 chapters, and then John has 21. So we have Matthew being the most comprehensive as far as amount of words, amount of material. Luke coming behind that, then John, then Mark, being a very short gospel, only 16 chapters. The second thing I want us to look at, and this is what really helped me, is when I began to understand who it was written to. What I mean by that is when you look at the material in each of the different gospels, you get a clear kind of idea of who the particular author was really trying to appeal to with their material, who they were basically writing the gospel to. You know, now we know that it's for us, it's for the church, it's for everyone, but when we look at the content of each of the specific books, we see that there is a definite intention around words that are used, stories that are told, and the way in which the material is even organized to appeal to a particular audience. This really helped me. Because once I began to understand that each of these Gospels had sort of a focus, a more centralized focus, it wasn't just a random story or narrative of Jesus' life, that there was a purpose behind this specific writing, it really helped me to be able to understand the material within it a little bit better. And so Matthew is written to the Jews. Written to the Jews, and as we fill this out, you'll see some evidences of that. Mark was actually written to the Romans, or we'll say just Gentiles in general. Gentiles. I'm going to switch out pens here. The Gentiles being those that are just not Jewish. Does that make sense? So we got Romans, Gentiles. Then Luke was written to the Greeks. That's a much better marker. I bet you can see that a lot better. And so by the same token, also written to Gentiles. Because Gentiles are just people who aren't Jews. And then John was actually written to, and we'll put the church here, but sort of a universal audience is what we could say there, John written to the church. So number of chapters, who they were written to. Now let's look at this. Christ viewed as. What I mean by that is that through each of the different books, we can clearly see that there's a specific sort of view that the author is trying to give us of Jesus Christ. Now, John said, if we recorded and wrote down all of the things that Jesus did, there wouldn't be enough books to contain it all. So what we have here in these four Gospels is just a little piece of all that Jesus was and all that Jesus did. I am thankful that when we see Him as He is, when He returns the second time in His glory, we will know exactly and have a full idea of all of this stuff, because now we just kind of see dimly, right? As through stained glass, but one day we'll see clearly, and I can't wait to really see the fullness of all that Jesus is. I'm excited about that. But we can see a lot of Jesus in this. And so Christ being viewed as different ways throughout these different Gospels. In Matthew, we see Christ is really viewed as the King. Now, we can start to see some comparisons here, because if Matthew is writing to the Jews, then the Jews are very concerned about what? When's the Messiah going to come? When is this great King of the Jews going to show up and save us from all this mess that we've been in, deliver us from our oppressors, and establish a kingdom as was promised to David and Abraham and all those that came before, and fulfill the promises of Moses and all of those things? They're waiting for a king. And so when Matthew is writing, he's writing to the Jews. It makes sense that in writing to the Jews, he's really kind of portraying Jesus as the King. All right, and we'll see some more aspects of that too. Mark is writing, and he has Christ viewed as the servant. The servant. Mark, only 16 chapters, writing to the Romans, sort of the shortest of the Gospels, who was the person that Jesus said had more faith than anyone else? It was the Roman centurion, right? And there was something about the Roman mind, the Roman concept of how things operated, the Roman understanding of authority, which is what really Jesus was commenting on. The Romans understood servanthood. They understood authority. And so Mark, in writing to the Romans and this group of Gentiles, it makes sense that he was portraying Jesus Christ as the servant, the one who would come and serve and lay down his life. They understood that kind of relationship there. So it appealed to them. They were able to grasp that concept. Luke, on the other hand, he was writing about Jesus Christ being viewed as the perfect man. Now, if his audience are the Greeks, then that makes sense too. I mean, when you think of Greek history, Greek literature, Greek art, you got the statue of David. Were I to remove this shirt here, you would see clearly the statue of David before you, standing picturesque. I'm just kidding. You don't want me to take my shirt off. I am far from being the perfect man, except my wife doesn't think so. But anyways, so you understand that the Greek mind was all about beauty. It was all about thought. It was all about, the David figure and all of those different things. And so appealing to the Greeks, his audience, and portraying Jesus as the perfect man was really a great way to connect, right? Even today, when we attend services on weekends, one of the great challenges of a communicator, of a pastor, of a teacher, a preacher, whatever, is to appeal, to connect with the audience. It's so important. And so in a very real way, we see the authors of the Gospels really finding that piece that they could latch onto to connect with their audience. Obviously, the Greeks being this understanding or pursuit of the perfect man and stuff like that. And then finally here with John, he portrays Jesus as the Son of God. the Son of God, or the Word. And so now, I mean, more than anything, if you're appealing to the church, this universal group, you want to know all about Jesus Christ. Who is the head of the church? Who is the founder of this? Who was he? What did he do? His deity. He is the Son of God. And I hope you're getting an idea of how all these are connected here. So now let's look at key elements. Key elements as we hustle through this here. So as you're drawing out your diagram, I hope you left enough space on your paper there. So key elements here would be, in Matthew we find a lot of prophecy, and actually we'll do this, we'll put OT, Old Testament prophecy, and we also find a lot of teaching. Once again, look at the pattern here. Matthew is writing to the Jews. Since the Jews are his audience, he's really focusing on Jesus Christ being the king. And if Jesus Christ is the king, then how do the Jews know he's the king? Well, Old Testament prophecy says who the king's going to be. Old Testament prophecy is setting the stage and letting the Jews know when the king is going to come, who he's going to be, what he's going to look like, what he's going to do. And so more than any other of the books, as a matter of fact, Matthew has 53, at least, Old Testament prophecies. Way more than any other book. The second most is Mark with only 30-something. So it confirms the fact that, hey, Matthew, writing to the Jews that Jesus is the king, he's the Messiah, let me connect the Old Testament with you. Let me help you understand that this prophecy means Jesus. This prophecy is about Jesus. This prophecy is about Jesus. And on the same token, the Jews, gathering in the synagogues and the rabbis teaching, they were very aware of teaching and information and knowledge and passing all those things down. You see how these are all connected? It's really kind of beautiful when you see that. So when you're reading through Matthew, you're understanding, okay, the filter is this is written to the Jews. That's why there's so much stuff about the Old Testament. Okay, that's why there's so much more teaching than any of the other Gospels. Other Gospels have teaching, but Matthew focuses on it more than any of the rest because he's trying to win over the Jews and reveal to them and help them understand that Jesus Christ is the King. Key element here of Mark is action and the crucifixion. I knew I spelled that. I think I got it right. Okay. Crucifixion. Close enough if I didn't. Anyways. So now think of it this way. Mark, young. It may be that Mark was the one who fled the Garden of Gethsemane when he was disrobed. The Bible doesn't say clearly, but many of those that have studied New Testament history and stuff like that say that it's very possible that Mark would have been with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane as just a young, maybe a teenage boy, and he was probably the one that fled and left his robe behind and ran naked from the Garden of Gethsemane. But my point is that he's a young guy, right? Short. If you're young, you're like, please don't, I'm not interested in all the teaching. You don't have to connect every Old Testament prophecy with me. Give me a couple of those. Give me 16 short chapters. Get me through it. Give me action. Talk about the biggest event ever. Mark was there, saw Jesus die on the cross, probably had a huge impact on him. And then appealing to the Roman mind, understanding that servant, what is it about a servant? A servant acts, a servant does, a servant, and then connecting the action to this servant, the one who was God that came to save the whole world, actually served to the point of death and gave his life for everyone else. Wow, kind of blowing the Romans' mind, if you will. And then for Luke, a key component is parables and miracles. We'll say healing miracles. Matthew has a lot of parables. Mark has some parables, but Luke has more parables than any of the other Gospels. Because think about it, Greeks, philosophy, right? Aristotle, Plato, all of these different, Greek minds and things like that. And the idea of mystery and working through problems. Man, that's parables, right? That would really appeal to someone who was of a Greek mind of like, wow, a riddle. Okay, cool, I can connect with that. So Luke is connecting with him about these riddles, Jesus being the perfect man. And what about healing? Well, Luke was a physician. And so as a physician, he was very interested in talking about healings and emphasizing Jesus Christ's miracles of healings and stuff like that, which also appeals to the Greek mind as well. And then finally here in John, we have great symbolism. Oh, and I can't wait to get to John because we're going to talk about some really incredible symbolism in that book. And then other miracles. John only has 8 total miracles in the entire gospel, but the miracles are so intentional. There's a real message that the Apostle John is trying to get through, and he uses a great deal of symbolism to build upon that message. And it's really kind of a prophetic message to the church as a whole, the universal church. So I hope you're kind of seeing some really great things here as we go through. I'm going to fill in the rest here, but for sake of time, I don't know how much time we're going to be able to discuss many of them. A great theme of Matthew, one of the great themes of Matthew is the kingdom of heaven. Kingdom of heaven. One of the great themes of Mark is discipleship. Discipleship. One of the great themes of Luke is Christ's example of love. Christ. Told you I wasn't good at this. We'll abbreviate. Of love. And then one of the great themes of John is the deity of Christ. Once again, you can begin to connect all those and how they all play in here. And as we get to each of these books specifically, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about those. Now the last thing I want to put on here is unique material. What I mean by that is, when we look at the Gospels as a whole, all 4 of them, they're really 2 types. Now they're all narratives, they're all stories of Jesus, but these 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are what we would call the synoptic Gospels. I'll put it up here for you. Synoptic Gospels. Really, it's 2 words, Latin, optic. You could probably figure out what that means, right? Eyes, having to do with the eyes, or seeing. And then sin. Think of words that have that prefix or that Latin reference there, sin. Synthesis, synonymous. So it implies being together, right? And so that's really literally what it means. So the synoptic Gospels are seen together. Now we see that as far as unique material. And so, for instance, what we're doing is comparing all 3 of these, and we're saying, well, all 4, and we're saying, of the all 4, how many have same stories that are told? How many have same teachings that are told, similar miracles that are told? There's a Bible out there, it's called a parallel Bible, that they'll actually line up all the Gospels for you, and you can see where the stories are the same. Matthew telling it from his perspective, Mark, Luke telling it from their perspective, and the differences there, which is a really cool Bible, because you can kind of read through the life of Jesus and see how all the Gospels kind of lined him up that way. And so the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have a lot of similar material. As a matter of fact, only 7% of the book of Mark is unique. So 93% of the book of Mark is also in Matthew, Luke, or John. That's pretty interesting, right? Matthew actually has 42% unique material. So 58% of Matthew can be found in the other Gospels. And then Luke has 59% unique material. So a little bit higher, they're almost 60, so 41% of Luke can be found in the other Gospels. Now look at John. At least 92% unique material. That means that only 8% of John, less than 10%, is actually in the other 3 Gospels. That's pretty fascinating. So as you begin to read through the Gospels again, I hope this really helps you kind of frame those out and helps you understand the Gospels. And so what we're going to do here for the rest of today's class is I'm going to push this out of the way. And I just want to sit down and talk with you about the focus of the New Testament. You know, it's easy in a survey class to spend a lot of time talking about the books, talking about the structure, talking about the chronology and the authors and all of those things. But I think that the most important part about the New Testament is Jesus Christ, right? I mean, Jesus Christ is the one that is the centerpiece of the New Testament. Our Lord Jesus Christ is the centerpiece of all creation. I mean, the Bible declares that. And Jesus Christ was foreordained before the world was even formed to come and be the sacrifice for our sins. Like God had in mind when He created the world, His Son, Jesus Christ. He is the most precious part of God's heart. He is God incarnate. He is Emmanuel, God with us. His work, His very existence and presence communicate to us the reality and truths of who we are and what God wants to do through us. And so there's so much to talk about Jesus. And what I want to do is just spend the next few minutes here kind of walking through the life of Christ, if I could do that with you here, and kind of setting the stage and helping you to understand sort of in a very brief overview the chronology of the life of Jesus and some of the things that really have impacted me about Him, and will continue, to as I begin to continue to study these things, have a deep impact on me, on things I continue to learn. Every day when you wake up, you need to be praying, Jesus, would you just show me, even Moses, God, show me your face, show me your glory. And Jesus Christ is the glory of God. And so His example, everything about Him is beauty, His character, everything about Him is love. Everything about Him is all we need. And we have, as New Testament, New Covenant believers, the Holy Spirit inside of us that enables us to see Jesus for who He really is. And so it's not just a story. These Gospels are not just a story of a really great guy that did a lot of awesome stuff on planet Earth. These Gospels are the story about a person who came, walked this earth, and yet was human and fully the Son of God, Jesus Christ. And so let's look a little bit about, let's spend just a few minutes here on this. Jesus' life on this earth, there isn't a lot written, before He was 30 years old. And so it's easy to kind of try and categorize His life. And one way to do that is to put it into maybe 5 different major divisions. We know that the story of Jesus begins in Matthew and Luke with genealogies and Jesus' birth. And so that first division of Jesus' life would be His childhood, His birth and childhood. That would be number 1. And so we're going to talk about that for a couple of minutes. And then the second division of His life would be after He's baptized in the Jordan River, and His ministry really begins at around the age of 30. And that would be referred to as the year of inauguration. From time to time we'll have presidents that are elected in this country in America, or wherever you're at, and typically there's an inauguration after an election or an appointment or something like that. And so this is that year, the sort of the coming out year for Jesus Christ, that year of inauguration. And then the third division would be the year of popularity. This is that period of time where Jesus traveled and just masses gathered around Him. And then the fourth division would be the year of opposition. There was a turning point from this division of a year of popularity to a year of opposition, and the Jews, the Pharisees, Sadducees, other teachers and others began to rise up against Him and try and kill Him. So that year of opposition. And then finally the last section would be Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. The last week of Jesus' life. And so we have the childhood on one end, we have the last week of Jesus' life on the other end, and in between we have that 3.5-year period of ministry that Jesus was here on earth. Have you ever realized that? Jesus only operated in His ministry for 3.5 years. Like ministry, like released into the ministry kind of thing. And so He did more in 3.5 years than anyone, any cumulative collection of anyone has ever done in their entire life. A pretty incredible impact that the life of someone in 3.5 years could affect all of history, past, present, and future. So the story with Jesus really begins, as I said, with the genealogies in Matthew and Luke. And so Matthew tells the story from a certain perspective, and typically it's from a male perspective, in contrast to Luke, and only because Luke has a tendency as a physician to really dwell upon those that are in the margins, those that are down and out, the poor, the oppressed, those that are on the outskirts of society, which in the culture of the day would be the women, typically. And so Luke has a lot to say about women, and his perspective kind of comes from that way there. And Mark and John both start with the baptism of Jesus. So they skip Jesus' childhood altogether. So we have very little about Jesus' childhood. We have sort of the story of His birth and that first couple of years there, And then all of a sudden, it's a blank slate until we have a story of Jesus when he's 12. And at the Passover, when Joseph and Mary bring their family to Jerusalem for the Passover, that they actually, when after the Passover is over, they leave Jerusalem and don't realize for 3 days that they left their 12-year-old son, Jesus, in Jerusalem. When they hurry back to find him, where do they find him? In the synagogue, discussing the scriptures with the rabbis, with the Pharisees, with the Sadducees, with all the learned men. And pretty incredible response that Jesus has when Mary's like, where have you been? I mean, imagine if you're a parent and you lost your kid for 3 days, let alone 3 hours. I'm in Walmart, I lose my kid for 3 minutes and I'm panicking. So 3 days, they go back and Jesus says to them, well, didn't you know I'd be about, be in my Father's house? And so his heart was always to be in the scriptures and all of that. And so we wonder, we don't know for sure, but we wonder at what point did Jesus realize that he was the Son of God, the Messiah? Was it just something that he was aware of from the moment he was born? Or maybe at 12, talking about being in his Father's house? Or at what point along the way did he realize that he was the Messiah? The world that Jesus was born into was a world that was pretty much oppressed, and we talked a little bit about that. Heavy taxation, actually incredible advances in technology with the roads and different things like that. A period of great oppression for God's chosen people, the Jews, and a period where there was a lot of religious syncretism, and we talked about that. The blending together of religions and kind of the blurring of the line between differences in religions and things like that. And then, of course, a population explosion, which led Caesar Augustus to call all of the world together to come for a census so he could tax them. Look at the time of Jesus' birth, and you can kind of see some similarities to where we're at today. Great advances in technology, a population explosion, oppression of God's people, all of these different things taking place. Heavy taxation, great disparity between the classes. It's pretty incredible that we see history really repeating itself, and the sense of and the fact that we are in the last days before Jesus Christ comes back a second time. But needless to say, things weren't looking too good for Israel. And this is the kind of environment into which Jesus was born. Remember, God had divinely selected, handpicked this time for his son to come into the world. And so that's something to remember as we discuss through this. Now, Joseph and Mary's journey to be taxed, you may not realize some things about this, and there's some great books that are written on Jesus and the life of Christ, and some really great ones that I've read, and some that really tried to help get people, the reader, into the reality of the situation, because it's so easy to be removed from a story unless you can connect it. And so I'm going to try and fill in some blanks for you here. And one of those is we talk about, we see on Christmas the story of the Nativity and all of that. Here come Mary and Joseph, and they're traveling to Bethlehem because they want to get taxed and all of that, because they have to be recorded in the census. But did you realize that Mary was probably about 9 months pregnant? Can you imagine that? Traveling on a donkey for a number of months, being 9 months pregnant. That's pretty radical. Or not a number of months, but traveling. The distance between where they were and where they had to go to be registered during this period of time in the census was 100 miles. Almost 100 miles on the back of a donkey, 9 months pregnant. That's pretty radical. Imagine them getting there, and as you know, there not being any place in the inn for them, and Mary and Joseph having to go down to the stables, which is where Jesus was going to be born. But as we talk about this, we see that in the Old Testament, even the little details of where the Messiah was going to be born had been prophesied about hundreds and hundreds, maybe 600 to 700 years before the event. In Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, it says, "But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times." Clearly talking about the Messiah, clearly talking about the very city in which the Messiah was going to be born. And here it is in the day of Joseph and Mary, coming to fruition, being fulfilled right there. So it's pretty powerful stuff. They get here to the manger, to the barn, staying Saying the place where all the animals were kept. And if you have any idea of how the animals were kept in barns and things like that, imagine this, that it's so crowded in the city that there's no place for any people to stay in any of the rooms. And they all have to travel with their horses, donkeys, sheep, everything they're bringing. They're all crowded into this barn here where the animals are being kept. So it's not like this serene, peaceful, empty barn with all this clean hay everywhere. As a matter of fact, it's probably the exact opposite. Just chaos and smells and sounds and filth. And it's a place where the animals are kept, right? And then a manger, right? A manger really basically is a feeding trough. So here's Mary. Just picture this. Mary, 9 months pregnant, about to be given birth to her first child, and her husband Joseph is looking around like, where in the world are we going to put this baby once it's born? And he sees a manger over there. Guess what? It's a feeding trough for the animals. The place is packed with animals. Do you think that it was sitting there pristine, in perfect condition? No. Matter of fact, it was probably full of slop. It was probably a mess. So what I'm trying to do is paint this picture of this scene, and here's Mary, and here's Joseph, and Joseph's looking around. He's just being a great husband. He grabs that thing, maybe flips it over and dumps all the slop out. Doesn't know what to do to clean it. Maybe he takes off his own coat and lines that thing so their newborn baby will have some place to lay. This is the context. This is the story in which Jesus is born. That blows my mind. Here's God who sovereignly determined this is the way it's going to be. And it's not the way in which I would have imagined it. That God, having His one and only Son, Himself, God Himself coming down to earth to start a mission that will save all of history, save all of mankind, past, present, and future. And it's this? When you begin to look at it, you're like, wow, what's the message behind there? What is God really trying to communicate to us? There are three groups that witness Jesus' birth: the shepherds, Simeon and Anna in the temple, and the wise men, all representing different groups of people. You have the shepherds, kind of people on the outskirts, kind of the lower class, see in that. You have Simeon and Anna, who are those that are eagerly waiting, sort of those that have spiritual eyes to see, are waiting for the Messiah. They're looking, they're reading the scriptures, they're studying the Word. And then you have the wise men who represent the Gentiles, a world in expectation of they don't even know what. Even today, the world's expecting something. They're not sure what it is, but there's a sense of expectation in our world today. And we know that Jesus is the answer for all of those. It's a funny story about the nativity scene and elementary school. You know, every Christmas all the schools get together and they do that. And as the wise men come to bring Jesus their gifts, you know, the first comes and says, "Hi, I'm giving gold," and the second person comes and says, "Hi, I'm bringing myrrh." And then as the third child comes in this play, the wise men, playing the wise men, just a little, you know, 6 or 7-year-old comes and kneels before Mary and the baby and Joseph, and they're looking down and saying, "Wow, what an honor! Here he is, the Son of God." And the wise men, the child playing the wise man, looks up and lifts it up and says, "Frank sent this." You're like, what? It cracks me up because we know it's frankincense, but the way the child had understood it was that, hey, you know, they were all bringing gifts, and hey, by the way, Frank sent this. It communicates that a lot of times, and it's just a funny way of saying that a lot of times we don't really connect with the reality of what was going at the time, what was going on at the time. Like, this was a radical period of time. Think of Jesus. Jesus was a real person. He had a real mother. He had a father, Joseph, who was actually his stepfather. So imagine in the context of community of Jesus' life, that those who were close to the family and understood, and maybe even beyond, because communities in that days were very close, maybe it was common knowledge that Joseph wasn't actually Jesus' father. That Mary, she'd actually gotten pregnant before Joseph wed her. And as a matter of fact, Joseph just made her an honest woman and married her. They hadn't heard from the angel Gabriel, as Mary had, that behold, you're going to have a son and he's going to be the Son of God, right? This is something that Mary had received and communicated to Joseph. So maybe the community at large thought that Jesus was an illegitimate child. You ever thought about that? Jesus growing up and having those around him kind of view him, maybe some of them view him as an illegitimate child?